Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our first session in our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion webinar series. My name is Everly, and I'm the Membership Director here at the Greater Wilkes-Barre Chamber. Just a few housekeeping items before I pass it over to our sponsor, PNC, for a brief video and a few comments. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. To be respectful of everyone's time, we have allotted time at the end for question and answers. But in the meantime, feel free to ask questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll by submitting them in the Q&A section or in the chat box. The event is also being live streamed on Facebook for anyone watching on Facebook. Please enter your questions into the comments section and we'll make sure we get to them. Recording of the session will be available on our Facebook and YouTube pages by early next week. Last, if anyone is interested in joining our Diversity and Equity Inclusion Council that helps put on these events or staying up to date on our efforts within this arena, please visit our Get Involved tab on our website. Fill out a brief form, we'll get your information, and then get you involved in the different things. To get this started, let's see a brief video from our sponsor, PNC Bank, and then we'll hear from John Rossetti, who'll help introduce our speaker for today.
Make today a knew you had it in you day. Make today a we need a bigger trophy case day. Make today a learning the basics day. Make today a finally going in on season tickets day. No matter the day, PNC has the financial tools and technology to help. PNC Bank. Make today the day.
Great. So thanks, Ben. Well, on behalf of everyone at PNC, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. At PNC, we embrace and promote diversity and inclusion as a core element of our values and our culture. When the Chamber approached us late last year about getting involved in their inaugural Diversity and Equity Inclusion Conference, we immediately signed on as a sponsor. When COVID sidelined the in-person event and that was planned for April, Lindsay and Ben at the Chamber did an excellent job at transitioning the commitment to ongoing conversation about greater inclusion and equal opportunities to this webinar series. So as recent events have illustrated, we all have a role and a responsibility to create more opportunities to positive understanding and change. So we just want to thank all of you for making the time to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion today. So I'm going to turn it over to our speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Teri Ooms, who is the Executive Director of the Institute. The Institute is a research and social innovation organization that uses data and analytics to identify solutions to organizations and community issues. So Teri, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here with you today to talk about diversity and inclusion as sort of the kickoff to the whole series that the Chamber is producing. My talk today is going to focus on demographic changes as it relates to race and ethnicity, and basically to talk about how change is constant and how many of the principles that we will be talking about relative to dealing with change at the end, it really applies to most every aspect of the way we do business and the way we live. So with that, let's get started and talk about the region and race and ethnicity. So first of all, as we look at diversity and inclusion, it covers a number of points. As I mentioned, today's emphasis is going to be on race and ethnicity. And nothing is more important than talking about these issues, despite the fact that some might find it uncomfortable. The current events of 2020 with police violence and COVID make this topic imperative. Inequities in public health, inequities in other areas, and discrimination in many forms have reached an unprecedented peak this year. Like so many things, this journey will take us through awareness and hopefully acceptance and respect. With today's focus on race and ethnicity, we need to really understand what those two terms mean. Race is associated more with biology, whereas ethnicity is associated with culture. In biology, races are genetically distinct population within the same species, with some genetic differences. As human beings, we all belong to the same species, and there are small genetic variations that, such as skin color, that divide us into races. Although we may be divided into races, science is telling us that there are major changes in DNA that have evolved over as few as 100 generations, and things that have divided us, like skin color, may be drastically changed in the coming years. So another look at the difference of biology versus culture. It's important to differentiate so that we can better understand what's happening in our region. Too often these terms are used interchangeably, and they really are very distinctly different. We're going to look at our region's story and talk about different elements of the region as it relates to population and race and ethnicity, and how it's changed over time. If we look at the population of Luzerne County, we can see that there were some massive periods of population growth that began in the early 1900s and really culminated through the 1930s. By 1920, we had about natives from 36 countries call northeastern Pennsylvania their home. There was another boost of individuals from Slovakia and Lithuania and the Ukraine in the 1980s, although they didn't push the population up significantly during that time. We know that the population increased in the 20s, 30s, 40s because of the anthracite coal. It was a job generator, it drew people to the region, and as we transitioned to natural gas in the 1950s, less people were needed, the coal industry began to wane significantly, and then we started to see people leave. They followed the jobs. Population is comprised of multiple different factors, including births and deaths. So we'll talk about those first. As you could see from the data that's trended over time, and up until today, by the way, 2018 was the latest data available. 2019 data was released today. We see that we lag behind the Commonwealth in terms of our birth rate, yet we exceed the Commonwealth's ratio in the death rate. So we know that changes in our population are negligible when it comes to births and deaths. However, there's another form of population growth in communities and regions, and that's migration. Let's not confuse this with immigration, although immigration is certainly a part of migration. Migration is simply people moving to and from a particular area. So we've tracked migration, inflow and outflow over the past decade or so. And we noticed that there were some major increases when we first started tracking. Prior to 2006, there was not a significant increase. But what we at the Institute are calling the population boom early on was the westward migration. It is when people started hitting our area after moving from major cities like New York and Philadelphia to the outer ring suburbs, and then they flowed into both the Pocono Mountains and the Lehigh Valley. And they saw explosive growth prior to this. And then we started seeing growth as people continued to migrate further west, primarily because the cost of living in those areas increased dramatically over that period of time. So you could see that since we've been started tracking, we've had a net increase of nearly 3,000 people coming from those areas. A small portion of that is directly coming from foreign countries, but most of it is coming from other major cities. And it certainly doesn't mean, however, that the folks that are moving here are not representative of other countries. When we look at the foreign-born population from 2000 to 2018, you can see that there is a major increase, about 6 percentage points in that period of time. And that's very significant to note that that population changed that much in 18 years. With the increase of foreign-born individuals in the area, we also see the use of other languages. And you could see that the number of individuals speaking English only has dramatically decreased during that 18-year period, and that about 4% more of the population indicate that they speak English less than very well. The Spanish languages are showing the most increase in terms of household languages. When we talk about languages and other issues, we then move on to ancestry. Now, ancestry is mostly associated with geography. It is the geographic origin. So if you look at the population, you could see that Luzerne County has ancestry that's rich from Poland, from Germany, from Ireland, and from Italy. If you go all the way into the second table at the very bottom, you're going to see other, and there was a dramatic increase from 2000 to 2018, and that's primarily the Hispanic ancestry, and that would include anybody from Latin America, Central America, Puerto Rico, Cuba, even Spain, that would fall into that other category. When we look at race, we can look at the changes in population from the same period. And you could see that there is a decrease of the white Caucasian population in the region of not quite 10%. We see increases in Black and African American population, in American Indian and Alaskan Native, as well as Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. And then come the broader categories, some other race or two or more races. So they are census categories, and we don't have specifics of what those two or more races represent or what those other races represent. Now we can look at ethnicity. This is the change in the Hispanic population as a percent of total population. The green bars represent Luzerne County, and the blue bars, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as a whole. As you can see, we've had exponential growth in population from the Hispanic community with origins all over Latin and Central America, and even Puerto Rico and Cuba. One thing that's important to remember is, again, that this is an ethnicity. So you cannot put these numbers into the breakdown of race that we saw on the prior slide, because we're talking about two different things. Hispanics can be white, they can be Black, and they can be a combination of any of the other races. So they are two different major categories of information. I'd like to also just put in a short commercial here. As you notice, the last several slides were data that we pulled from the US Census Bureau, and we're running out of time for the 2020 census. And having access to this data that's relevant and real and close to being accurate is extremely critical for a whole host of purposes. So if you haven't participated in the 2020 census yet, please do so. So let's talk about cultural diversity as it relates to economic growth, and there is a correlation. To put it simply, diversity spurs economic growth and homogeneity slows it down. That is the bottom line. I think you could put different words in here and say innovation spurs economic growth and a lack of innovation slows it down. And that simply means change and responding to change and being proactive in creating change. And so that's what we need to look at as we look at our economy. Diversity generates more global competition, a variety of language skills, new ways of thinking and innovation, new cultural activities, and of course, one of the main drivers that excites everybody is a variation in food, new types of food and food festivals. And we've seen that grow tremendously in our region over the past 5 years alone. So economic strengths in terms of vibrancy, adaptability, and resiliency are really what we hope to have in our economy in order to keep it stable, in order to keep it strong, and of course, in order to harness any types of growth opportunities. So we can compare these attributes of a strong economy with the attributes of diversity. So when we talk about vibrancy, a vibrant economy supports a mix of economic activities and promotes economic security by enabling job opportunities, improved standard of living, access to basic needs like housing and healthy food and education opportunities, and even social and recreational opportunities. And that correlates with what diversity brings in terms of vibrancy, new events, new foods, new stories, and new ideas. And we can translate this into those new businesses. There are pockets of Luzerne County and even Lackawanna County where we could see a surge in entrepreneurship, where Hispanic-owned businesses are popping up to serve not only their respective communities, but everybody that lives in those communities. When we look at adaptability, diversity causes disruption, it causes change. And in economics, we look for change. We have to be primed for change. Accepting change and reacting or responding to change creates new opportunity, and that only strengthens an economy. And then when we look for resiliency, diversity brings some vulnerabilities with it. It's openness, it's trust, it's increased social interaction or different social interaction. And when we look at it in terms of the economy, that's recovery and acceptance. And that resiliency that develops as a result of that keeps us strong, even when economic times may not be so positive. When we look at discrimination that occurs, we need to understand that there's discrimination at various levels. By far, the biggest and more powerful level that serves really as a foundation for other levels is structural racism. This occurs in normalizing and legitimizing an array of dynamics as it relates to historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal activities, which advantage white population while producing adverse outcomes for people of color. It's based in a system of preferential treatment. And this is indicative of what we're studying now, which is called redlining. And redlining is something that came out of the New Deal. It was an opportunity that was viewed that owning residential real estate was a form of power. And so the federal government created neighborhoods that were redlined that they felt were of poor socioeconomic status, and they put the cost of housing in those redlined neighborhoods well above what people could afford. They also attached credit requirements, so individuals in those redlined neighborhoods applying for loans would not be able to get those loans. And what they did through that whole process was force segregation. And those neighborhoods became the poorer neighborhoods with people of color, and ultimately are probably more diverse now. So the concept was called redlining. It still exists to some degree in all of the documents that were created for preferential treatment in lending. And the maps that were created are stored in the National Archives. Our organization has access to those maps now for Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, and we're doing a socioeconomic analysis to see if that redlining that started in the 30th has really created neighborhoods that are poorer and have less opportunity and are primarily housed with people of color. And so we will have that research available at the beginning of October. Another form of racism is institutional racism, and that occurs within organizations, and it involves discriminatory treatment, unfair policies, and inequitable opportunities and impacts. And something like this, just like we've talked about with other areas of discrimination, and what I mentioned at the very beginning, does not only necessarily apply to race and ethnicity, but also to gender identity, sexual orientation, individuals with physical disabilities, or just physical differences. Interpersonal racism occurs when private beliefs come into action with others. So for example, if a person does have racial or discriminatory thoughts, and in conversation there's public expressions of racial prejudice, hate, bias, or bigotry, then it becomes an interpersonal racism. And then finally is the individual level of racism, where there's private manifestations, which could have just been generational in nature, or because of lack of experience or exposure. And so with these 4 levels that are really grounded in that whole structural level, we need to enact changes at a foundation or a systemic level that voids preferential treatment. And then that should help lead the way for changes at the institutional, interpersonal, and even individual level. Companies need to look at how to handle things like this, diversity and inclusion and potential racism, and create more equitable environments, whether it's for their workforce or even for the customers they serve. So one of the things that we espouse to is human-centered management approaches. Basically focusing on the individual, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their orientation. There is an understanding that behind the person's workday performance is a whole other life. And a lack of understanding of their everyday stressors or problems can sometimes manifest themselves in the work environment, and as a result, affect that work environment. And without management's awareness, good people can face hard times on a professional level. So human-centered management approaches really allow management teams to look at the whole of the individual, with the understanding that their personal lives, their family lives, and many of those elements such as race, ethnicity, sexual orientation play a role in how well they are able to do their job. Companies can also form equity committees, and these committees can look at management, they can look at policies, they can look at marketing, they can look at recruiting that's used for workforce. What I would encourage you to do is ensure that that equity committee is staffed with individuals who represent the communities that you're trying to ensure have equitable opportunity. In other words, the committee should not be made of just a particular management team, all men, suits, all women, professional, but have the equity committee be as diverse as the community that you are trying to serve, both internal to your organization as well as external to your organization. In addition, there are a number of racial equity tools out there where businesses can use to do a self-assessment and help them devise the internal policies and practices. But again, I encourage engagement. And if your organization isn't very diverse, most likely you may be marketing to a diverse community. Make sure that you gather the input directly from those individuals, because they do experience it very differently. They see things very differently, and their solutions are likely very different from everybody else's. And with that, we have to look broader. We can all play a role in encouraging systemic changes to reduce structural racism. It certainly has been embedded in our history and our institutions and policies and culture. And these do shape experiences and conditions at the individual level. But I think we all have it within our power to address this. And it's important to address it early on, to make it part of the discussion. It doesn't benefit to hide from it or not address it. That does not promote positive change. But addressing equity, racial and otherwise, through things like program development, strategic planning, and even communication strategy can help advance organizations and help to create opportunities for everyone. So with that, I thank you, and I am pleased to respond to any questions, or if you want to engage in any kind of discussion, now's the time.
Awesome. Thank you, Sherry. There's a lot of great information in there. So if anybody has a question right now, if you want to put it in the question and answer box or in the chat box, give you a couple minutes to do so. But one thing I want to ask you, Teri, was you mentioned in your presentation about the red line research that you're doing, and it'll be complete around October. Where, if anybody's interested in seeing the results of that, how could they get access to those results?
We will be posting the study on our website, and we will blast it out to everybody through our mail lists and social media accounts that it is available. And certainly, Ben, I can let you know, and you can share it with the council.
Awesome. All right. Just seeing if anybody has any questions or answers. Give it another minute or two. Maud, you're not seeing it on Facebook, are you?
No, sir, we do not have any coming through on Facebook.
Awesome. All right. Well, Teri, I think that was an awesome presentation, and thank you again for breaking all that down. I think sometimes looking at a data sheet for people could be intimidating. I think you did awesome in breaking that down and going through the terms that I think we see a lot. So appreciate you being on with us today. We will have this posted later on next week, early next week, that anybody who's interested in viewing. And if you do have a question, feel free to shoot it over to myself. My email is ben.eaton, E-A-T-O-N, @wilkes-bear.org. We'll get that over to Teri to help answer any questions you might have. But thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Teri. Thank you, John. And if anybody's interested in joining us next week, our next week's topic is career advice for women. And that's Thursday, September 24th at 12:15 again. And Teri, someone had a question of if they could get the PowerPoint presentation by email. Could we send that out?
Yes, definitely. I'll get it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Then, yeah, we'll get that out to everyone. Include with whoever registered, we'll include that with the link to the recording. So thank you again, everyone.